My name is Dean Daderko, and I'm a curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston. I want to welcome everybody to this new edition of CAM Connects. And today I am extremely excited to bring together Laura Drey and Julia Barbosa Landois, who are two Houston-based artists. Hi, Laura. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Dean. Hi, Julia.
So in case folks are wondering kind of what brought us together, a few weeks ago, Julia Barbosa Landois reached out to me and sent me an email with a draft of a new video work. And we'll show portions of this as part of this video. And it moved me really deeply. And I thought about it for a while and thought about some of the issues that it brought up. And I quickly started to also think of the work of Laura Drey. And I'd become familiar with Laura's work as I have with Julia over the years. And thought that the most exciting thing that I could think of doing was getting these two people together for a conversation. And I would be able to kind of facilitate that and get in on it. So thanks so much to both of you for doing this. I guess I'd start off by offering that I feel that both of you, in really distinct ways, very sensitively think about notions of home. You know, what it is to be at home, what it is to find home, where home exactly is. And in a moment where lots of us are actually spending time in our physical homes, I think that this notion of home that exists in both of your works exists sometimes in a domestic, sometimes in a more spiritual sense. And both of you also make very personal stories available to viewers through your work. So you bring kind of light and lightness to, you know, deep and kind of deep personal spaces. So I wonder if both of you might kind of start off by reflecting on the idea of home and kind of how it exists in various ways in your work.
Yeah, I'd like to take that on. So, you know, my artistic practice, it consists of me working at the art table, in the kitchen, in the car, any place that I can kind of carve out. So that's been really a bit of a personal challenge that I at first really detested, because it's like I just want to get in the studio and work. And so that started to really influence like how I worked, and what I just started thinking about those things, the idea of working at home, and just trying to figure out what that place is. So it presented a challenge, like where is home and where does my art, because I find that all of my art practice was happening at home.
Right.
But between like life and home and kids, that was also happening in the car. That was happening between doctor visits and waiting rooms, airplanes, all kinds of weird things. And I started to learn a lot about that and myself and how I defined like home. It wasn't a very direct thing. It started off with me trying to figure out my practice, but then my practice is in the home. And then I just kind of started seeing these things about how migratory all of that was. And then also pulling out and looking at a bigger picture of like, well, this is me in this context with the abilities that I have, and the things that I have in my world, and really kind of started to think about those overall, pulling out what does that look like for other people, whether it's an art practice or not. The things that they practice in life in a way. So for me, it was just all these fleeting moments that were continuously shifting and constantly being redefined, and that really started to impact the practice and the home. They started to kind of come together more. And yeah, so it really started to influence the way I started to work.
Mm-hmm. And Julia, how about you?
I think a lot with my work, particularly my performance work, I've looked at the personal and the public, and the personal maybe things that happen at home, or maybe are how the life of the artist is versus the persona of the artist, or things that are very intimate and difficult to talk about, and then shining light on that sort of thing. And a lot of that is happening at home. Also, finding wonder or something sacred or just really fascinating about the everyday, and trying to be really conscious of that, and using what you have in a limited surrounding.
Yeah. I think, Julia, can you maybe talk a little bit about the work that you made that's called Labyrinth? Physically, kind of what it is, and then also, I think it'd be fun to talk about how it, well, we can get to that later, how it like influenced this new video that you've made.
So Suburban Labyrinth is an installation work. It's about 19 by 22 feet, and it sits on the floor. It's made for people to walk on top of. And it looks like a walking meditation labyrinth, but the pattern that's on top of it is a composite of suburban street maps from Houston, which are also very labyrinthine.
Right, with all the curves and cul-de-sacs and things.
Yeah, I moved here about 3 years ago, and I still get lost all the time. And the materials that it's made out of is from the debris piles in my flooded neighborhood after Hurricane Harvey. So it's made of people's homes. Kitchen shelves and disassembled IKEA furniture, closets, kind of everything that you never saw before when you were on the outside, and now it's out.
Right. And the piece, if I'm correct, kind of doesn't exist in that same form anymore. Isn't that right? You did it for the Luminaria Festival in San Antonio first, and then it kind of got dissembled, but became some other things afterwards.
It did. It started in the pile and kind of ended in the pile. I really liked that. I mean, I was thinking about the waste cycle of construction and how that happened with the hurricane, and also thinking of materials when you're thinking about a sense of renewal. And so they came from the debris pile, they became an art piece, and then it was huge. It was 19 by 22 feet. So it was disassembled, and then it became wood for student projects. And one of my neighbors who was flooded, who had part of their house become part of the labyrinth, then retook the pieces and made furniture out of the pieces. And some of them grew mushrooms on them. Somebody took some of them to build a horse barn. So it just dispersed.
Yeah. And I think what people will also kind of see is that both of you are really committed writers as well. In the video clip that we'll show Julia, there's a moment where what people are hearing is a prose piece that you've written that kind of exists over the top of it as audio. But Laura, also you, I think what's very interesting is to kind of think about the relationship of writing that exists in your work, because it exists on multiple levels. I think there's a way in which you engage drawing, and writing kind of happens in the drawing, whether it's legible or not. But you're also doing a lot of journaling as well. And I wonder if you might kind of talk about some of the writing that you're doing.
Yeah, that was actually a really nice surprise how it started to kind of come out. The work itself, they vary in sizes. They can be very small pieces, like a 4x6, and then some can be much larger where they're like 26 by 20. And I thought of them as,
we're talking 4x6 inches there.
yes, in the 4x6 inches. Yes.
I was thinking of the little drawings that you did on tea bags.
Yes, exactly. And all of the material and all of that, they vary in sizes and the material. And I always thought of them as sort of palimpsests in my head, kind of telling someone's story or not, or showing, or things like that. And so it's this idea of recording that's constantly changing, but archiving and disappearing at the same time. And I just felt like that was really speaking to what I was trying to convey. And I felt that I started doing more writing into the pieces, and it started to change. And then I thought, why don't I just start actually writing? And I did, and I loved the idea that it was just a brand new layer to add to the work, which for me, this idea of layering like past and present, and it gives me this opportunity to layer other subjects and topics that I want to introduce, whether it be about past and present, generational thoughts, those kinds of things. And so, yeah, I started journaling even more and just started writing some poetry to go with the work. Sometimes it's read in front of the work. Sometimes it's actually interwoven into the work. Sometimes it's just the prose itself.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the pieces that you've made, like taking old burlap or polyethylene, like vegetable, like onion or potato sacks, and kind of weaving lines of text on paper back into the open holes in the weaves of those pieces.
Yes.
But I'm also actually thinking about the poem Cruzando that you wrote, and I wonder if you might kind of read that and share it with us. Is that okay?
Sure, not a problem. Let me grab my glasses. Okay. This is called Cruzando. Families crossing bridges into a future, valleys and coastlines, meandering waterways, feeding the land, one end to another. Men working the fields, sweet golden rows of citrus, berries, and melons, one end to another. Women all day, together and alone, scared to move because they don't know how. Fields of gold are not for them. Under a bridge, babies in arms, all day, together and alone. For some, modernity is mobility and independence, job and wealth, leisure and travel. For them, it's trekking the land in dark nights, dodging spotlights, escaping a perilous past, yearning for new tomorrows as modernity passes them by. They stand tucked away at the underpass. They are not seen. They are invisible. Pero tengo que hacerlo. They have seen the things not meant for them. Pero tengo que hacerlo. They still see a future. Pero tengo que hacerlo. And because they have a will that can be broken, they remain exhausted even after a full night's rest. They are disheartened despite the hope that the crops yield. They are overwhelmed by their fears even after they let go. They are scared of the freedom that is meant to lift them up. So they get carried away, invisibly drifting, but moving, still. Tenemos que hacerlo.
Laura, I think it would be kind of great to, after hearing that, to maybe ask you to talk a little bit about where the writing and that kind of ideas are coming from. I know that you recently did a kind of performative lecture, let's say, Unsettled Space, right? That was supported by the Idea Fund through Diverse Works here in Houston. And I wonder if you can maybe talk a bit about the kind of trip that you took as part of that, and kind of the project that's coming out of it.
Sure. So a lot of the writing and the work is really it comes from the storytelling originally, and the conversations that I've had all my life with my grandparents, and then later on with just my grandmother as we got more deeply into it. This idea of what I knew as a kid and then what I know now through this adult lens were very different stories. And yet maybe it was the same story for her. There was just a lot of questioning that came from that. And so it's the matrices for the work. It's the grounding tools of the work in general. Telling stories about their life coming to America as migrant farmers. What that life looked like weren't necessarily things that I remember her ever discussing growing up, or for the fact that my parents or aunts and uncles really discussed. It was kind of a quiet thing. It was a thing of the past. And so those questions came, and it left me thinking a lot about, again, with this idea of home, like what my home and art practice looks like. What is that for others, and what does it look in the various migratory states that they come in? So I had this idea that there was this connecting tool or places. That's what it was really what I want to say. There were these places in the stories, whether I was talking with my grandmother, uncles and aunts, or strangers, as the more the practice grew, the more I interviewed and talked with just people with different stories. A lot of them, being that I'm in Texas, a lot of them stories were reflecting on places like McAllen and Harlingen and Brownsville, and they all were connecting points for me for some way or another, even though I had never been. And so I thought, well, I'm working on this, but I've not actually been to these places. I think I should go. And so that was the idea. That was the premise of this newer work of the writing and the weaving projects. What would that look like if I did go to these places? If I could retrace based on various stories and interviews, what if I could retrace some of the places and the routes? What would that look like if I started to navigate the fields in the only way that I know how, and with my own family right now? And I approached my mom and my daughters. Not all of them were able to come, but I think the idea of this generational approach was in there. And so it was my mom and my daughter and myself, and we went down to the valley with really no expectation, just to find ourselves, to experience and see what would happen. The conversations were so rich in the car. Our fears of things that were happening in the current day, politics, versus like what we knew was happening, say, to my mother at the time when they were crossing and living in these places, versus what we thought, because we've never been. It was a really, really rich and opening experience for me personally, for my daughter, and my mom. It was a real bonding experience to better understand what this means outside of just what's happening in my own family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think, Julia, maybe some of these kind of really similar issues of family come up in your work, and especially in performance. We were really fortunate to be able to work together on the Right Here, Right Now San Antonio exhibition, And there, besides a series of serigraph prints that we showed of yours, you did a number of live performances of a piece called Serious Work, that I think really brilliantly blends these kind of ideas around family and artistic practice. I wonder if you can maybe, if that's an interesting place for you to also kind of think about that, like how that work in particular kind of addresses issues of family in your way.
So the performance involved coming out in front of the audience and was set up as though it was going to be a 70s era endurance work. And then with my phone, the screen of my phone projected presumably as a timer for this endurance work. And then the performance begins to unexpectedly break down because I start to get texts from a friend, from my partner, and then aside from this veneer of the artist persona, you're getting all of this really intimate information about my life. My child has a fever, and my partner doesn't remember how much he weighs, and so how much Tylenol to give him. Conversations about dating. And so I really wanted to break down what's expected of a live performance in that way, and also break down what's expected for the life of an artist, and particularly an artist parent, which can often be pretty hidden away. What else would you like me to say about
I just think there's kind of there's so much interesting stuff in that. I think also, like, you end up using in your work, like going into these kind of domestic spaces, but turning them kind of upside down, and kind of revealing kind of very poignant emotional content that can be kind of located in them. And I think it's a really special part of the work that you're doing, that kind of sense of the domestic in there.
Mm-hmm. And of the audience, and acknowledging the audience, I think, and all of the insecurities that come with being in front of an audience, and knowing that they are looking at you and looking at your body and looking at pieces of your personal life that come across the screen. And
right, because part of the performance is that when you get up there and kind of set this timer off, you also disrobe, so you're standing there naked in front of everybody, up on a kind of fairly high dais that was in the space. So there's also that aspect of it, and of being that vulnerable in that moment.
Yeah, interestingly, I had a conversation with a friend afterward, and he started out by saying, "Oh, wow, that was great, and you were so brave to be up there." And I thought he was going to say something about, "Oh, I could never be naked in front of a bunch of people." But what he said was, "You were so brave. I couldn't imagine somebody else looking at my phone screen." I couldn't imagine somebody else seeing my personal texts, and it was a great moment.
Yeah, now here we are. Kind of everybody's like living on screens these days.
Yeah.
So I also wonder, I think one of the other the kind of parts of these works that starts to unite everything is that both of you end up playing with kind of like in between spaces, right? Whether these are like in between aspects of identity, there are ways in which you kind of like respond as women, as people of color, as social and politic citizens, as moms, all of these things. And it's about all of these layers and the kind of layeredness. And both of you have really rich, kind of richly layered work. And I wonder if you can kind of talk about those, like how you see sometimes those layers coming together or jostling against each other in your work.
Yeah, the layering was an important part of my particular work with the weaving. I mean, like literally the weaving and the layering of those things. But this idea of weaving all the different themes and topics into that, coupled with weaving in all the hats that I have to wear as a person, like the mom, like depending on what I'm weaving in, if I'm really into like things, if I'm really wearing the mom hat, then somehow that kind of comes out, or this space where I'm feeling a lot of the in between, the ambiguity of like the beautiful Mexican heritage that I have, and then things that are going on in the world today, and like how does that couple? Where am I in that? So it does very subtly come in and out. I think that's really important to me in the work. I'm not sure how to go on that, and that it's a natural kind of progression to it. It's maybe a time thing. It's also that, so it couples all of those things in.
And I feel it's a process, right? In both of your work, it's like it's something that constantly gets like, it can change, it can be like renegotiated, whenever you feel like it doesn't fit.
And there's some days where it seems so easy, and then other days it's so challenging to like, what am I weaving? Because one, like in life, can get stuck in just doing the process and not really being aware. And so then, that can be challenging to like pull yourself out of that so that you're aware, and then when that happens, it's really nice because it offers me new threads to go by. Like right now, currently, I'm really on this thinking about this idea of all of this work, but the labor, my hand in it, the labor intensive work. So it's going from this idea of, yes, there's still this idea of addressing the migratory state, things like that, but being able to introduce these layers just kind of introduces like a more microscopic look for me. Like, wow, not only am I doing this, but I'm really working my fingers off here, And so then I'm in this context of to labor. What does that mean? What does that look like for me as an artist here today against backdrops of either the past or the present? Yeah. The constant layering.
Mm-hmm. Julia, what about layers for you? Is it do you think about the work in that way at all?
Yeah, I try to have multiple levels of connection. So there's a surface image, and then usually there's something going on underneath, and there's ways that I'm trying to connect to other people and their experiences, even if they're not having the same experience as me. So the parts about the performance that are it's about being a parent or being an artist, but it's also about that intimate and public thing. Or the labyrinth started out being about this very specific experience in the hurricane, but it's also about loss, and it's about learning to relinquish this idea of this illusion of control that we have. I also talk about someone in my the death of someone in my family during this time, and all of the ways that those things connect to each other to help you process and see the little things that become profound in the world around you. My kids do a lot of dramatic play and make-believe games, and walk around the house or outside, just talking, whether inside these make-believe games, and they have this phrase that they say all the time that I have been thinking about a lot, where they say, "Pause the game," and then they say something that's real or true, and then and so I think about my work sometimes as me trying to pause the game and be outside of it a little bit and pull together the connections, but then connect it back to the game.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like in your practice in particular, there is that kind of often a really energetic exchange with the audience. It's that sense of connection was really palpable in the space when you were performing serious work, for instance. And I wonder if you can maybe also talk a little bit about the kind of physical work that you're doing, like some of the silk screens or that work, because I think right now, like, hearing you say that you're thinking about this phrase, "pause the game," made me think about some of the prints that we showed, and maybe you can kind of talk a bit about those.
Those prints were a series playing off of examining the words mother, mom, and madre in English and in Mexican Spanish, and phrases that in direct translation they sound innocuous, but in Spanish they're very disrespectful, or in English the way that you might use mom as an adjective for something that you don't want to have, like a mom haircut.
Or mom jeans.
Yeah, mom jeans. So it was a playful response to that. And I like to make, I love performing, but I also just still love to make things and work with my hands. And so often when I'm thinking about performance and writing, I'm just making stuff on the side. And then sometimes when I get lucky, that stuff that I make with my hands is a compliment to the performance work or the video work that happens. And so those text works that were about how we view motherhood and moms then went with this performance that was about my real life in that situation.
I wonder actually if either of you have questions for each other or kind of thoughts about each other's work, because we've gotten a chance over the past couple of weeks to meet up and kind of look a bit at each other's work.
Yeah, Julia, so like I love this idea that you do with the labyrinth. When I was watching it and then like looking at freeze clips, I would pause it and I was taking it like the natural image that comes out, like these and I think we talked about this before, like I think it was purposeful to have like this image that looks like a Mayan shape or something. They were so natural in how they came out. And I've been thinking about the idea, you created this grid and you said they were based off like maps or something like that of either the city or the place of the flooding. I don't quite remember, but this idea of doing research and referencing and how that influenced this idea of the labyrinth even more. And so I've been thinking about kind of that concept, in a way, it's always been in my head because of the idea of a migrationary path, right? You know, and taking this trip. And I see that video that you do, and I guess I'm wondering, is it just constantly, how did you get to that point? I'm not even sure what the question is that I'm like, but I'm just really fascinated about this idea of this grid being part of that and these patterns. Did you expect that to really happen? Like, when I look at that, these patterns are actually not just grids to me, but they're like a symbol of something ancient. And was that like a happy accident? You know, I find like that happens in my work, and maybe it's not a happy accident. Maybe it's finally just voicing up like it needs to claim its space. So did that come along early on for you? Was that a starting point, or how did that happen?
It started with me thinking about the waste cycle of construction. And then I came from San Antonio, and San Antonio also is very sprawl oriented. And this experience that I would have when I would visit people in the suburbs and just get completely lost, particularly in the past before there was GPS. It was a really harrowing experience.
I can imagine what that would be like without
yes.
GPS.
So I started looking at the maps, and then I guess it was a happy accident. All these shapes just started popping out to me, looking, like you said, kind of ancient, but then a little futuristic at the same time, and also like Mayan glyphs, and shifting between the macro and the micro view of, like, the bird's eye view is this bizarre pattern that we've imposed on the landscape, and then the more micro view is being the vulnerable person who's actually stuck inside of that pattern. Wow. And shifting between those two realities.
Yeah. And then you, of course, like kind of bring in another layer, because I think maybe what happened is, I remember a conversation after Right Here, the Right Here, Right Now show, when you were in residency at Lawndale Art Center, and seeing a piece that you were making and some things that were in the studio, including an exercise bike. And you were kind of like talking about making this animation of a snake that's eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, but which was something that riding the exercise bicycle would actually power.
Yeah.
The video. And I don't know if that was part of this piece, but it feels like something that, you know, by the time you get to the final video is somehow in there.
Yeah, well, in the video, you end up where you started. You're going around and around through the labyrinth as the prose unfolds, and then you end where you started, as though you're just going to begin again. And so a lot of my work lately has been looking at those cycles, and also ways that we feel trapped or feel like we may be able to get out, and humorous, absurd parts of it. Like, just, I feel like the exercise bike just as an object is a really funny, absurd thing, because it's a mode of transportation that doesn't take you anywhere. And so connecting that to an animation that was, again, referencing these ancient symbols. You're in the moment, that absurd moment of trying to control the speed of infinity, and thinking about what that means.
Fantastic. Yeah. I'm excited for people to be able to have a look at it, and to have a look at the video, and to kind of understand that the image that they're seeing also had this total other life as a separate sculpture and installation earlier on.
Someone I love is dying, and I am using their saw to make something new. Ashes to ashes, debris pile to debris pile, like the smudge on my forehead at the first Mass of Lent, another act of mourning and renewal. I made art from those piles. Annie's bed, what's-her-name's kitchen shelves, the mid-century cabinets from the house we almost rented and someone else mucked out when the water went down. Now it's a flat file stand, bookshelf, horse barn, scrap for student projects, benches, table, unidentified mushrooms. And trash again, too.
Julia, did you have any kind of questions, any things that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I had asked you a little bit about this before, but I'm still so interested in your writing, which I love, and I know that you love to do, and how that exists with your physical work. It's always hard for me as someone who works in a few different media, because I'm thinking, how on earth am I going to connect these things and like you said, put the threads together. And so then it's inspired by the writing, but then also you're adding the writing when it comes to the physical part of it. And so how do you like to see that happening in a performance lecture, or do you like to have something that the audience, like, do you want to read it? Do you want the audience to be reading it as they're looking at the physical works of art? How do you want that to happen?
Yeah, that's all kind of in flux right now, which is why I love getting to know your work, because you're in a place with this performance that is new to me. This idea that I'm going to get up and actually like put prose to the work and share that out loud. There's this sort of performance element. I mean, I'm not going into it straight like that, but it's like what Dean said, like a kind of performance lecture or reading. I like the idea that not being able to call it something also relates to the work, that it's constantly moving, and that idea. So in that sense, it gives me permission to try different things. So I don't have one way right now that I can say, I think it's best this way for the audience to experience. But I have learned that it does need to change. Depends on the space, or who might I be sharing some of this prose with, because sometimes that's really just my thoughts, personal thoughts inside, and that's just like another layer that I'm exposing, and so sometimes I have that permission to pull back. But recently I got to show some of the work in Chicago, and it was an experiment to take another piece, which was a bit of a video clip that I've had, kind of like, what am I going to do with this? I felt like it was saying something, but I didn't know what, but it had to be a part of this conversation. So really what it was just running on a channel quietly, and then I was bringing in this layered voice, and I was reading bits of interviews and stories that way. So that was a new way to perform that kind of prose with the work in the background and some of the pieces that I've made. I've gotten a little more daring, like I'll walk around the piece, and if I know that in my own head this particular story, is what I was really with when I was making the piece, and that's the anchoring spot in the space for me, so that it's somewhat generating this like layer in that way, in the space, actual physical layer. There's me, there's the work, and then there's kind of this voice and the audience participation. Some of it, I find it's really scary like that. It gets really quiet because I don't know if the audience knows what to expect. Am I about to pop out with a song and dance, or like this kind of, she's just saying this bit, and then we're going to interact. And so that's been really experimental process, which is why I was so intrigued with like how you then layered like the grid part in that, because I'm looking for ways to compress the work sometimes or pull it out. So yeah, it's all an experiment, but I find it liberating to just have any old way and give myself permission to do that, just simply because I don't know. I was like, well, this is the path I'm taking today.
That's where the good stuff happens.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, I wonder if that might be a good spot for us to kind of stop for just right now. Unless anybody else has kind of final stuff that they've thought about saying that they didn't get to say.
I don't think so.
Awesome. Thanks so much for you guys for doing this. It's super fun to get to be together and talk a bit about all these issues in your work. And I'm excited that folks will be able to learn a bit more about your work through this video.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that you connected me with Laura, and I hope one day we can see each other in person.
Right. Yeah, I look forward to like really having a studio visit outside of Zoom, coming in, touching the work, the way us artists like to do things, get all into it. So yeah, the opportunity, it's been great.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, y'all.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye.